last week I actually did a story just seeing a ton of now hiring, we're hiring signs all over Spokane. I talked to a couple local business owners, Delicious Hamburgers, and actually out in Liberty Lake, the Trailbreaker Cider. And they're saying, yeah, we're struggling to get people to come in the door and even apply for these positions, even though things are opening up. So I guess I wonder if you can, just to kind of begin, if you can speak anecdotally about maybe this trend we're seeing with an employee shortage in Spokane.
Yeah, I mean, there's really two issues. One is actually research based. And so the Federal Reserve recently went out and reviewed a bunch of recent academic research on whether or not the unemployment benefits, the extended benefits, have been causing people to not return to work. And the evidence is that by and large, it is not preventing people from going out and searching for work overall. The problem is if you look at specific industries, the evidence suggests, based on, again, research looking at how much those extended benefits pushed up those individuals' incomes, it might be causing some of those individuals who started out with low pay prior to the pandemic to increase the amount of time they're out of work because their pay is considerably higher under the income replacement of the extended unemployment benefits. And food service is going to be one of those industries where you might be subject to more people holding back because of those extended unemployment benefits.
So if you're in so you're saying if you are in the food industry and you are currently on unemployment, there may be a lag behind in getting back into the workforce because that unemployment benefit may have a higher cost than the job you had.
Higher benefit to you. I mean, if you look at the academic research, if you look at food service, under the first CARES Act that it first extended these unemployment benefits with the additional $600, for a food service worker, the typical food service worker, they were making 170% of what they were working. And so
on unemployment.
So in other words, their income replacement was way more than 100% under the initial CARES Act, right? Compare that to if they hadn't done anything to the original unemployment program, the replacement pay under the original program would have been about 50% of their pay if they'd been working. So for certain industries, the income replacement was more than 100%. And for certain industries, that may be causing people to stay out of the labor force a bit longer.
Is that, can you speculate? I mean, is that, is this the result of maybe unemployment not following through, some maybe checks and balances? I know there was the requirement where you had to be actively searching for a position.
And they did soften some of those requirements too. And it's important to remember the reason they did all of this was to prevent consumption from collapsing in the United States. I mean, what we learned from the Great Depression is that if there's no income supplement when you lose your job, consumption tends to go through this downward spiral and just continues to make the economy worse and worse. And so the purpose of this whole thing was to make sure that US consumer consumption didn't collapse. And the evidence suggests that it was fairly successful in doing that. Now, I'm pretty sure that over time, these extended benefits are going to go away. And I think people are going to resume more normal kind of working behavior and job search behavior. I don't think the industries that may be experiencing hard to find workers because they're holding back from searching for work, I don't think this is long term. And so, you know, it's a little rough now, but I think as they wind these extended benefits back, things are going to return to normal, conditional on a couple of things. And this is important. The decision to go back to work is being complicated by a couple of other factors, not just the unemployment benefits. You have childcare issues that are lingering out there. I think that's holding a lot of people back from entering the labor force. And you have risk aversion. I mean, the reality is a lot of people maybe don't have great insurance or they're have no insurance at all in some cases. And so getting sick is a real risk, and that may also be holding them back from taking jobs in environments that are public facing.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because when we did our initial story on this, that's what a lot of folks had said on our
Mm,
Facebook comments. Are like, hey, I
mm,
don't have the ability to get childcare or the shifts that
mm,
work with my need for
mhm,
childcare, as well as
mm,
some folks just aren't comfortable yet. They don't feel safe
mhm.
going back out into the workforce. So I'm glad you touched on that. You mentioned the
Well,
Federal
and
Reserve. Oh, go ahead.
well, no, and I think that's why the vaccine component of this is so crucial in kind of normalizing the labor market again. Without the vaccine, it would be really hard to normalize labor market activity again.
So then I wonder, you'd mentioned the Federal Reserve study looking at
Mhm,
unemployment.
mhm.
So I wonder, is this employee, oh, let me move my videos around here. So would you say this employee shortage is it a local Spokane trend, or is it a statewide or even national trend?
It's a national issue. And again, it seems to be more focused in industries that were low pay to begin with, uh, but also construction, because, the construction sector is kind of an anomaly along with healthcare. These are two sectors that have essentially done pretty well for obvious reasons because of the pandemic. And so there are also labor shortages there. But in that case, it's because there's so much demand for those services right now, they're having trouble finding people to work in those sectors. And they were
Mhm.
struggling pre-pandemic, so it's even harder now.
Yeah, yeah. And so then one of the other questions I had here, let me change my view again here. Bear with me, I'm TDing my own.
Mhm. That's right.
So can you say, are hospitality or retail
Mhm.
jobs, are they starting to see a decline in interest, while other industries that have been less impacted by the pandemic seeing an increase in job interest?
Only to the extent that people who are working in retail or leisure and hospitality have the skills to transfer. And so one of the things I think a lot of economists are going to be interested in is what happens to enrollment in like community colleges as a result of this pandemic. Are you going to see people start to search because of their experience for jobs and skills that make it less likely that they're vulnerable to a recession? And
Run
so
that by me
it will
again.
be
So,
interesting. So, one of the things a lot of people have discovered that they're pretty vulnerable to this kind of event based on the kind of occupation they had before. They were in leisure and hospitality, uh, uh, maybe retail, public facing retail. And so one of the issues that economists are going to be interested in is how does this affect schooling? What happens to the demand for like community college training that will allow people to shift professions into something that's more resistant to recessions?
so maybe keeping an eye on, we could see that it implies
Mm,
folks are maybe searching for more education to get those
mhm.
higher paying jobs to find another career.
Right. And, I mean, the evidence is clear. The higher your education, the more training you have, the higher your pay, and the more options you have in the long run.
And so I guess, I mean, we're looking at, restaurants. I mean, those are minimum wage, at times minimum wage paying
Mhm,
jobs,
mhm,
other
mhm,
hospitality positions. So um, other industries were not as impacted by the pandemic.
mhm.
So I guess, can you speak to what those industries may be seeing an increase in interest, or folks getting that those additional skill sets to shift careers?
I think it's too early to tell at this point. I mean, but there are industries that definitely have performed well during this pandemic in terms of people's um, job and their pay. I mean, if you look at the evidence, the higher paid, higher skilled workers in the US have really suffered much less than lower paid, lower skilled workers in the US. And so anybody who observes this is going to be really interested in jobs like accounting, going to be maybe jobs in healthcare, uh, any kind of job where you have the ability to work from home if there is some kind of crisis situation like this again. I mean, again, the evidence is really clear. Higher paid professional workers have really done much better or survived much better than lower paid workers.
So then, to kind of reiterate though, is it fair to say that hospitality and retail, they were hit maybe the hardest and are now seeing the least amount of interest in folks searching those jobs out just because of the situation the pandemic's created?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think people could be reinterested in those jobs again if you get COVID really under control. And again, this goes back to the issue of COVID really being under control, people having confidence that if they do a public facing job, there's less personal risk involved, and also that we get COVID under control so we can get back to, again, using the word, normalizing the childcare sector, normalizing K through 12 again, because again, that's having a big impact on how parents make that decision to return to work, regardless of what industry they're in.
And I wonder, another point that some folks have made here in our community is, with the reopening phases, it's still very uncertain. And with us maybe going back into phase 2 or reopening in phase 3, a lot of people are saying that their concern is, why a search for a job that could just as easily close or lay me off once again? Can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And so again, this goes right back to getting the virus under control. And the primary way you do that is through medical science with vaccines. Because once you get the infection rate and the growth in infections really, really low, right? Then you stop that bouncing around between phases. And I think again, that's really what it's going to take to have kind of the certainty that the next month you're not going to be laid off, is because COVID is under control.
So it's fair to say, like, these factors that we're discussing, these are factors that have made some of the hospitality positions less enticing for folks to even pursue right now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so again, it's the personal risk issue, it's the childcare issue, and the question is, am I doing a little bit better on unemployment in some of these jobs than if I go back to work? Right. I mean, it's multidimensional, and for certain industries, again, it does seem to be causing people to sort of extend their duration for looking for new work.
It's also been, and you touched on this, I was hoping we could dive a little more. It's also been popular opinion that people aren't looking for jobs, they aren't returning to work just because that maybe that unemployment check is a lot more than they would be getting working. Is that true at all?
Well, again, if you go back to the Federal Reserve review of all the research that's been done, and I think they're right, I've looked at some of this research myself. Overall, it does not appear that these extended programs have fundamentally altered Americans' desire to work. It just doesn't seem to be the case. Now, there are certain industries where, again, because the income replacement is high relative to their original wages, that you are probably seeing some people resistant to returning to work right away. But I would also say it's not the only factor they're probably using in making that decision.
So another thing we're noticing, so Amazon is really picking up or expanding its footprint here in Spokane. So can you tell me, is Spokane's economy shifting because of new additions in the market like Amazon?
It is somewhat, but I think if you look still at the structure of employment in Spokane, one of the biggest emerging drivers, and this will be the case after the pandemic, is the healthcare sector, right? I mean, no doubt that, warehouse and transportation jobs are going to increase because of the presence of Amazon. But I would say really, if you look at the previous expansion that we enjoyed, really from 2009 to 2020, the single biggest contributor to job gains in the region was primarily the healthcare sector. And I would expect that to be the case going forward as well.
Might be something else to dive in with you here at another date. I know we've heard from nurses that there's a huge burnout though. So, I mean, with that in mind over COVID, I mean, could we see a crash in just, a shortage in people wanting to stay in that field?
Yeah, so if you read about the healthcare sector, and it's not just here, it's globally, there's growing concern about serious burnout and exit of in many cases, highly trained employees. And so, and again, keep in mind, this sector was struggling to attract enough people pre-pandemic. And so coming out of the pandemic, they're probably still going to have real problems with labor shortage on the healthcare side, especially in certain kinds of professions. And I would say nursing is going to be one of them.
That's a fair point. Let's see. So we are seeing, we kind of touched on this. Let me double check here. I'll skip that. So would you say are there any faults under current Washington unemployment guidelines that are driving this employee shortage trend?
That's a good question, and it comes up a lot. And the answer really is it's too early to tell. I mean, really, I always tell people I'm very sympathetic to all of the Pacific Northwest governors, because if you're sitting in that chair, you don't have a lot of great choices. There's a lot of uncertainty you're confronting. I would say that what we need to do as we go forward and we get COVID more under control is, all the states need to sit back and say, okay, what did we do? What worked well? What didn't work well? Let's do an evaluation here so that going forward, if something similar happens again, we really have a better idea of what is kind of closer to the optimal policy. And so for now, it's just too early to tell.
So then, I guess looking ahead, how do you see the unemployment trends changing? Do you see, or how do you see the employee shortage changing as we look ahead, maybe to throughout the following year or several months?
Well, I think so. I think until people are convinced that COVID is under control. I think some of these leisure and hospitality, the public-facing kinds of jobs that maybe aren't also super high paid, are going to continue to struggle to attract people, at least certainly for the next 6 to 12 months. That would be my guess. Whereas you have other industries like construction and healthcare, which are booming, they too are going to struggle to fill positions simply because there, may not be enough people trained for those slots at this point. And so I think generally speaking, it's going to be a tough environment for a lot of employers.
What do you say to the comment? I did see some of our viewers mention that they'd like to go back to work. They would apply for these hospitality, maybe fast food industry, but the complaint there is the pay isn't enough for them, as well as benefits. I guess the complaint there is maybe the business owners aren't giving enough incentive. I guess I wonder what your thoughts are on those complaints, I guess.
Well, it's gonna, yeah, it's a tough call, because if you're a business owner, there might be the wage level you might need to draw people back in may be inconsistent with you staying in business, right? And so you can get into this situation where, okay, let's say that you have to pay a wage that's dramatically higher than what you were paying for to get people to return to work. Again, it may not be consistent with your business model. And so maybe you literally can't do it and stay open. And, but even if we didn't have these extended unemployment benefits, I still think it would be somewhat of a challenge for businesses because of these other issues related to childcare and risk aversion.
Right. Well, I think that hits it on the head. I wonder if there's anything, I'll look through my notes here, but I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to add on that note that we didn't discuss.
Well, I would just a couple of things. One of the again, based on research that's coming in from all over the world, especially other developed countries like Europe and Canada and so forth. You talk about the impact of this recession on workers. It's been particularly hard on women, as it turns out, because if you look at a lot of the public-facing jobs that got hit the hardest because of this recession, there tends to be a heavy representation of women in those jobs. And that seems to be pretty consistent across countries. And so one of the issues economists are worried about is because there's been a big decline in labor force participation of women, how does that rebound going forward?
I did have one other point that I forgot to ask about. I have an interview coming up here with Home Depot. So we're getting a lot of releases from big box stores with hundreds of open positions, implying that you had mentioned this isn't a local or regional problem. This is a nationwide problem. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, again, I'm not surprised because, of course, retail is public facing, and probably wage wise, it's probably in that category where the income replacement of the unemployment benefits is better than what's being offered currently, and so they're going to be dealing, again, the unemployment benefit issue, the child care issue, the risk aversion issue, and again, it's across the whole country. So I'm not surprised from what you're telling me.
Is there anything Spokane is seeing a challenge in uniquely here that you could point out, or none at all?
Well, I would say by and large, we're kind of going through the same thing the rest of the country is going through. Now, there are some variations across states because of the policy towards reopening. And so, for example, you do see some difference between Washington and Idaho because of the way the reopening process is being handled. But generally speaking, a lot of the issues we're seeing in Spokane, you're seeing in other cities in the US.
And I wanted to make sure to reiterate, so I guess your take on Amazon's effect with these retail and hospitality jobs. I just spoke with a Davenport marketing manager, and he says, hey, we are struggling to find people who are willing to take up our hourly positions, cook, front desk. And he says, we're trying to compete with Amazon. We bumped up our rate to $15 an hour and added a signing bonus because we're aware of how competitive it is with the positions at Amazon. So is there an Amazon effect in all of this?
Well, it certainly increases the level of competition for employees who are willing to return to work under current conditions, right? I mean, so yeah, I mean, you have two new big, an employer like Amazon with two new facilities that need to be staffed, okay, for the existing labor force that is willing to participate and look for work. I mean, it just does mean more competition. And you do have that pressure to adjust your pay and benefits to try to compete in that environment.